Noia Māori, Te Ao Manuia, and welcome to Pasifika Wire. In this episode, we had the privilege of speaking to Samoan academic and researcher Wanda Ieremia-Allan. Wanda is a PhD candidate in the Pacific and Indigenous Studies program at the University of Waikato. We had a really interesting conversation with Wanda as she talks to us about her research tracing the intergenerational intellectual ngafa or lineage of Indigenous Samoan writing of the early 20th century in the former London Missionary Society newspaper or Sulu Samoa. The key strand of her work investigates the ideological, cultural, and gendered tensions inherent in the writing. She talks about the untold stories, the unsung heroes of this amazing part of Samoan Pacific history. So join us as Wanda takes us down her path, o le Sulu Samoa.
Yes, malo sufu mo malangi ma ya oe leo so ya amai se foi lau whaafonga mo na si iwi inga whaftai te ma ono le nei awa no le awawa ya whaalua ina lo whaftai i le li silio o le lo whanua nei i kirikino a te roa e mamana whenua o tai nui wa mwhai e ona fo ia le nei whanua sa whatalo whatfo le mamalo pa ia man mamalo Samoa lo whafonga mai. Thank you, Gladys. Really nice to be here. Whaftai te lava.
So good to see you and talk to you. And first off, how are you and your family during this pandemic world that we're living in? I understand you've got COVID in the house.
Yes. I think like many other ainga, we're certainly going through our struggles with COVID. So far, so good. We thank the Lord for the many blessings that we've had and the love of family and fellowships that enabled us to support and love one another. So the one child is all right so far, so touch wood, and she's enjoying not having to do her daily whiao, so good on that front.
Yeah. Fials, yeah, I'm with her on that. Wanda, like I said, thank you for this opportunity. Really excited to hear about the work that you are undertaking, in particular, o le Sulu o Samoa. Can you take us on that journey? Where did it all begin for you in terms of research?
Yeah, so o le Sulu Samoa, so I'll give you a little bit of background about the paper itself. O le Sulu Samoa, which is translated to be the torch of Samoa. It's a reflection of the Enlightenment period in which the Christians, the Palangi missionaries brought the gospel to Samoa, and in 1830 they landed in Sapali, Samoa, and then 9 years later, by 1839, they installed what was a rudimentary press, and they started this newspaper, o le Sulu Samoa. So it started in 1839, and believe it or not, it's still in publication today, which makes it possibly the longest running, and possibly the widest circulation too of this paper of the 19th and 20th century. And it's in the Ngana Samoa. So it's the first home of our grassroots reporters, our ethnographers, our biographers, all writing in the Ngana Samoa. And so this is why we don't hear about these stories, because history has always privileged the stories of Palangi's representation of us. Yet we don't tend to recognize or value or even see this incredible wealth of writing that's been produced by our own people since 1839. And so my interest has always been centering our voices, our stories, our philosophical paradigms to make sense of us and our place and our legacies and our place in the world today. So yes, it's o le Sulu Samoa is still in publication. Like I said, it's produced by the London Missionary Society. My experience of it really was as a paper delivery person, as a child of whaiwhiao. We were required to take the food to the elderly people. And what I noticed when I was a kid doing this was they were more interested in the paper, aside from the whaalalo from the whaiwhiao, they were more really interested in this incredible newspaper, which I never really paid much attention to. And I had, as a child, grown up in Mālua Theological College, where the old dilapidated print house was my favorite place to hang out, because no one ever went there. And so I guess as a child, I was really fascinated with this massive building, this concrete dilapidated building called the Mālua Print House. And also, as an adult, made the links about the papers and the texts that were actually produced from that favorite childhood place of mine. So that's what's really drawn me to this newspaper. And I had the opportunity to be part of this incredible project that was led by Professor Alice Te Puna Somerville as part of a Marsden project, Writing the New World, Indigenous Texts, 1900 to 1975. And she asked me, what would you like to do? What's the periodical that you'd like to investigate? So I really seized that opportunity to say, okay, well, where's our Samoan writers? We hear often of the stories of Samoan writing had started in the 1970s with, Albert Wendt. And while that's incredible, while we pay tribute to that incredible legacy in English, prior to that, and Albert Wendt acknowledges this himself, he was raised in the whāngongo that his grandmother and his grandparents had been teaching him, so all these traditions of whāngongo, English literature traditions, whole generations of people were raised, including Albert Wendt. So I don't want to speak for the amazing Albert Wendt, but it's an indication of the origins of our stories, not the origins of, sorry, the kind of literature that was produced, the rich literature that was produced at this particular period of time, late 19th century to the early 20th century. Yeah. Whaptai?
That's amazing to hear this, Wanda, because I was talking to a colleague, a news editor, we were talking about, the recorded history of our stories from the Pacific that date back to the period that you were talking about. And there wouldn't have been researchers or academics dedicated specifically to this. It would have had to have just been generated for the love of history. And I guess, this is what you're touching on. And for you, why is history so important? Why do we need to know this?
I think history ultimately is about making sense of who we are. It's making sense of the legacies that we've inherited from our forebears. And so for me, history, has always been about context. It's always been about what are the stories that we are told and we feed ourselves. And these are often stories that have been written by people who are not from the Pacific, right? And so we see these really unequal measures and balances of history that tell us stories that we've never really been part of in terms of its production and its dissemination. And so history for me is an opportunity. History means to me is an opportunity to contest the main narratives that we've already heard about, and also to center, more importantly, to center our stories so that we are authorities of our own knowledges, not being told by others about who we are and what we do or don't do, So, and I also, for me, as a Pacific and Indigenous studies researcher, I'm really interested in putting our researchers into positions where we can tell our own stories. And I was very fortunate to have been given that opportunity by Professor Alice Te Puna Somerville, and it's important for me also to do the same for, people in my community, including people in part of the research, because our knowledges have always been shared. Our knowledges have always been co-produced, and so this is part of the responsibilities as a Pacific Indigenous researcher and who's doing history, who's doing archival history, historical research, is to repatriate a lot of that, to center, repatriate, and to let people know that, contrary to what some of the governments tell us, we actually come from a significantly literate community. You know, we come from ancestors who were writing and were well versed in their own oral histories, but also people were learning about the histories of others, you know, and you know, it's remarkable to understand, or even to think about a little old lady, Tinao Tama, who's in the remote villages in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who are reading Sulu texts and are well versed in the works of Shakespeare, Tolstoy, you know, the Odyssey, Homer, you know, and these are people who haven't even left the villages, yet their literary education has been this multilingual, you know, well-versed repertoire of literary histories. And we don't remember that. Instead, we have policies that address, you know, that see a lot of our Pacific students as who don't read, who don't come from those cultures. So history for me is about reconciling the past and centering our own stories and telling our own stories of innovation, of excitement, of intellectual inheritances that we've inherited and forget that we have.
And you've touched on it because there's so much said about our oratory history. But like you've said, you're touching on, you know, the literary that goes back. And for you, for your journey, what did you discover about yourself and going through this research?
What I've discovered about myself is my responsibilities. My responsibilities to this knowledge, to the people who've written this knowledge, and the people who are needing this knowledge, who are wanting this knowledge. And so contrary to possibly, you know, the protocols in academia where one kind of extracts knowledge and guards it particularly as their own, this project has taught me things that I've already known about reciprocity, about generosity, about co-production of knowledges, about sharing and disseminating and bringing people to the table to add their voices to this really rich conversation. So a little bit of what I've been sharing about the project itself, I knew that this was valuable. I knew this paper was valuable because I myself read it as a child. You know, I read all these English fables. I was really interested in these Greek stories. But I also knew in the paper itself had all these different genres. They had, you know, children's whangongo. They had just a wealth of travel reports, ethnographies, just a variety of incredible writing, including obituaries. And so I always knew, and scientific information as well that were recorded, because people who wrote in this paper were not just Samoan. They were actually Niueans, Cook Islanders, Tokelau, Tuvalu people who were actually writing in Samoa. So that's kind of another layer of sophistication and cosmopolitan regionalism that we don't tend to think about. Is it wasn't just the colonial languages we were talking about, we were exchanging in. We all actually knew, because we're whakawhanaungatanga, we drew lineages and ngafa to each other. We also had a commonality in terms of coming together to produce something. And the Sulu Samoa for me represents that. It's the center and hive of writers from the Pacific who were trained in the theological colleges, were trained in the missionary colleges and the missionary schools in Samoa, because Samoa was the base of the London Mission Society network. So it received young 12-year-olds from Tokelau to Tuvalu. And so we're all trained in Samoa and Greek and Hebrew as part of theological training, but also the German, depending on who the colonial powers were at that time. They learned German, they learned English, and so on top of their own ngangana, and on top of that, Samoa itself. So I've lost myself in the question, but so it's this incredible wealth of writers who are producing this knowledge. And I guess to go back to your question about what have I learned about myself, is I've learned that I'm an insignificant number of people who are doing this work. And what that means is I'm part of this multilingual, intellectual ngafa of people who are doing work in the Sulu. And so as my responsible duty is to the next generation is to open the door up and say, hey, kiddo, I shouldn't say kiddo, hey, would you like to come and have a look, see if you can find anything that tells your stories, tell your family stories, opens up the opportunities for you to give an alternative view on this topic. And so this has always been a bit of a community research project to me. And so I've shared a lot of what I found, things that I think, in my limited time, of course, what I think is important. And for example, a more recent post has been about the Kalena Samoa, the Kalena Samoa Whamasina. So it's the Samoan traditional calendar. It's a 13-month based calendar that traces the migratory patterns of birds and fish. The calendar that tells you which crop to plant at this particular time. And so it's this incredible wealth of Indigenous knowledge. It's likened to maramataka for Te Ao Māori, Mataronga Māori. It's this 13-month calendar of, okay, so this is the season that the law is coming, which is a fish in Samoa. So this is what you need to do. Next 2 months is a month where you do uwhi, which is, crops in Samoa, the root crops in Samoa. So it gives you, these are really important archival knowledge, right? Because it tells us about our own seasons, our own met systems, our own measuring units that is often lost because we've privileged the Greek and Roman calendar. We're privileged the 12-month calendar that tell us absolutely nothing aside from what the Balinese value as part of the seasons. Whereas our calendar is this wealth of important information about science, about ecosystems, about religious practices that have been involved in the cultivation of these crops and the fish. And so what I'm really interested in is, why was that in the Sulu? So the Sulu is this Protestant paper. In fact, it reflects that Samoan people at that time hadn't just accepted Christianity as such. It was a hive of these there's ideological wranglings with, okay, it's another religion, we can incorporate that in. So it really reflects the innovation of Samoa in terms of these different cross-disciplinary practices, and it's, for me, to go back to your question, what have I found out about myself is I found out that I'm one of many people who has dealt with the Sulu, and with that comes responsibility to do it properly. It comes with accountability to make sure that the social linguistic aspect of the project has the verification and approval of different specialists, and also duty to include my own kids, other researchers as well, so they can continue this work for multiple generations. It's 181 years going, and I'm sure it's got another 181 years of reproduction of these incredible stories and knowledges.
And Wanda, just like hearing the passion that's coming through, you must be encouraged to see more Pacific researchers, our Samoan researchers coming through the ranks. Are you seeing that happening?
Yeah, so there's a lot of amazing work that's actually happening, in terms of linguistics. Sadat down in Victoria is a big plug for this. Sadat and his book about Liua'ana Samoa, which is being released as well, I think, next week. There's incredible legacies of the work of Professor Whanawhi Liua'ana, who's been doing this work for setting up the first Indigenous university in Samoa. She's been doing this work for 50, 60 years, and her children are also doing it as well. So there's a resurgence in the arts in terms of our myths and cultures. So that's all happening, really exciting. The university in Samoa is doing some incredible work as well. In New Zealand universities, I'd really like us to think about, while the Vaiasarongan Samoa is really important, right? We're celebrating languages. I really would encourage researchers to really think critically about the role of Ngana Samoa in our academic work. So Ngana Samoa, of course, is, is a cornerstone in our whaopenga, our whaasinamanga, but also it's an intellectual inheritance, like I've been saying, that provides key pathways into our different worlds. And a lot of those worlds are scientific, they're theological, they're religious. So I really would like people to really consider the Ngana Samoa as a pathway into those worlds, not as just an important part of our daily conversations.
And you've touched on a really important topic there about how we keep our history alive, how we keep the knowledge, the strands continuing way past, like you were saying, past 100 plus years. For you, just this journey, the research that's required, what's the next steps for you in terms of sharing this knowledge with the rest of the world?
Yeah. I think there's still a lot to be done with this newspaper. I think in terms of sharing what I've been doing as part of my PhD research, and my priority is to finish the PhD and to finish writing it, is to officially build a system where this newspaper can be repatriated back. I've spent the last 2 years collating extant copies of the newspaper. So I've got the biggest collection of probably close to 400 issues. I've spent a considerable part of that translating some of the articles that are really interesting to me. I've been sharing it with people in my community. I think the next shift of the project after the PhD is to then repatriate the work. And so that's looking at allies. And so I've been doing a bit of work with Auckland Museum, their incredible archivist there, Liua'ana Samoa, as well as Paula Hegel there, to really think about the kind of post-custodial relationships or approaches that are needed to be done by museums in terms of repatriating a lot of our stuff to our people. So I think the next shift in my project is to really think about what other newspapers are out there, what other Indigenous language newspapers, and I've already started some of that work looking into Tuvalu newspaper. So if anyone's really interested, and this is an appeal to any Tuvalu researchers to really think about other newspapers, that your Indigenous language newspapers to be centered, our stories to be not so much validated, because we validate on a daily basis, but to form the focus of our daily conversations. And so part of ensuring that the histories in the newspapers are safeguarded and repatriated is a big, massive collective approach. And that starts from museum and library collections down to the home, in which we have the opportunity, when we're reading the newspaper, when we're reading the Tusipaia, as we do on a daily basis, because that seems to be the primary source of our Ngana Samoa, right? Is the standard news, the Tusipaia, which is important, but to also add other texts as part of that family ritual, which will include an article in Samoa. What does this article mean? And as my daughter has identified, I've included a part of the story, and she was blown away by finding her namesake, her great-grandmother, whom she's named after, her writing in the Sulu about 2 children, which includes her. So these are places, archives are places where generations are meeting, they're finding a word, they're recognizing a name. And that's our ngangana, as Litara said, that's our ngangana too. As she says, it's an invitation for us to engage on what those pivotal points are. Even in a name, that's an archive, right? A name is a reflection of our histories. We know that whenever there's an incident in Samoa, someone's named. How many Apollos do we know in the 1960s when the Apollo spaceship went to the moon? Those practices of archiving, the practice of our Indigenous names, also carry with them these incredible stories. And I think the Ngana Samoa in terms of reviving it for people who are new to, who are on their learning journeys. Even if you just recognize one or two names or one or two words, that's more than enough to engage with your intellectual inheritance.
I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, Wanda, realizing just, I'm in the business of telling stories or sharing stories, but you have just opened up a whole new galaxy of information, and something that we really need to, hold dear to us. In your opinion, what would you say to someone like me? And I will say this, not in any condescending way. I'm uneducated in this area, New Zealand born, who knew about, I know about my Samoan, history with my parents, but not really enough. What would you say to us in learning about Ole Sulu Samoa, diving back into our history? What would you say?
I think not to be scared. I think, we all are afflicted with this kind of tendency to think that we're not good enough. We're not good enough Samoans, we're not good enough this or that. But, by actually centering our ngangana and our voices, we actually understand that that's ours, whether people say it is or isn't, you know what I mean? The Sulu Samoa for me is one of many newspapers, but it is, it's a site where people are also struggling with different writing traditions, with different languages. Like I said, people in the Sulu were multilingual. And I know that's a really high level to think about, but they too were in a position where they thought, well, how can I deal with that German text? Does anyone know what that Hebrew text means? Or, what does that mean in German? So I guess what I'm trying to say in a very convoluted way is it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be scared with the ngangana, but you've got to understand that it is your inheritance. And whether you understand a sentence, a word, a whole paragraph, that shouldn't stop you from trying, because that is your whaasinumanga, that's your whaalupenga. The other thing that I've learned about my comprehension of Samoa is, I'm not a linguist, so I'm not a specialist in Samoan ngangana, but someone has to do this work, right? And so doing this work is actually being humble to the task, as my professor Alice Tepuna Somerville says. You've got to be humble enough to know that you're not the authority on this. You will never probably be an authority on it. You're just the leading conversationalist in this. And what that means is you open the door for someone else to come and say, okay, well, this is what I think of this. And that is good, because our ngangana should never, ever be weaponized against one another. Our ngangana is rich. It's filled with our knowledges, our alofa, our moli alofa, our struggles. It has incredible legacies of talatu'u, tala whaasolpito, Samoa lalangi atoa. But it's a site where everyone has struggled. And I think that's what I'd like to share with people who are a little bit uncomfortable about learning Samoan, is just go ahead and do it. Do it. It is your intellectual inheritance. Do it. You'll be amazed you might even find an ancestor or two in there and be really humbled by their attempts and their efforts to really start conversations and invite you to these conversations. So our ancestors have been doing this. They've also been fraught with similar, I guess, senses of doubt. But at the other side of that is the bravery and the courage that equip them to actually do it, because we're here now 181 years later, talking about it and enjoying it and understanding that we come from these literary rich cultures, not on the receiving end of, the worsening statistics in whichever country we are, which other people like to talk about. Yeah, so be brave. This is your intellectual inheritance. Pick a word, pick a name, and just go with it. Incorporate in part of your daily conversations with your ainga, with your cousins. Tweet, TikTok, one word is that one step further into your Samoan worlds.
Thanks for listening. Visit our website at www.pacificawire.com. We welcome you to like us on Facebook, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can listen to the full podcast on Spotify. Whaafatai, mai e manuia.